supply chains and industrial policies. Mr. Yi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my views on global supply chains, but I will do it in Chinese. 我非常赞同刚才希普利女士对当前形势的
highly recognize the comments made by Ms. Jenny Shipley, as it is known to all, and actually we are living in a world and international community full of dangers, threats, and uncertainties. For the world economy, it is facing the headwinds of deglobalization. There are a lot of headwinds and segmentation of the international trade relationship and also the international trade rules. The multilateralism is facing a lot of threats in an immense manner. There are multiple challenges, especially the developed nations are actually having a lot of politicization of the trade issues, tariff issue, and also the so-called pan-security concept. They have a lot of protectionism and administrative measures to have a lot of imposition of the policies with decoupling measures in the high-tech sector, and also to have those kind of compulsory relocation of the supply chain and also the production capacity to their own nations. As it was mentioned by Madam Shipley, the unilateral sanctions are actually leveraged on the excuse or context of the maintenance of the so-called national security, which has posed a lot of threat to the international security, stability, and peace. And actually, the national strength and also the powers of positions have been playing a dominant role. And WTO, the arbitration mechanism, which was regarded as the pearl or the rule of thumb to address all the conflicts, all the arbitrations, all the confrontations, have also shown a lot of deterioration in its role and power. After the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the Bretton Woods mechanism and the other supporting pillars mechanism have also fallen apart. And also G20, the final mode and also the barrier, supporting the multilateralism and also the trade communities cooperation has also been meeting a lot of challenges. That means if another international pandemic takes place or the world economic crisis takes place, that means different countries in the world will have a high possibility of plunging into the world economic crisis or the Great Recession in 1930s. So the neighborhood among the nations and the good cooperation among the nations will fall apart by then. And the neighbors will not treat each other in an equal and amicable manner. No nation can stay immune to all those kind of uncertainties and challenges, and no country can fight alone or in a solo manner. I believe that for the major economies, they should treat these issues in a very open-ended or open-minded manner to be immune to those kind of trap of the so-called pan-security concept penetration. The major nations should be playing a greater role in the zero-sum elimination, and also WTO, the Bretton Woods system, or the overall ecosystem of the multilateral cooperation should be refreshed, re-established, and to build a win-win cooperation for all the countries. The world community should be governed by all the nations in an equitable and equal manner. For China, we have been highly integrated in the international supply chain and also the industrial chain. China is highly connected and correlated with other nations. For China, it is also confronted with high complexity in the safety, security, and needs for the further development. We are facing new international situations with a lot of headwinds and tailwinds at the same time. We need to better address the situation between development and also the further opening to the outside world. The premier of Chinese State Council, Li Qiang, has met a lot of German entrepreneurs. For example, those from Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Siemens, etc. And according to Premier Li Qiang, the biggest risk is not to have any decoupling and also not to develop is the biggest threat to all of us, to all nations. I highly recognize and applaud what Premier Li Tan has been mentioning in his meeting with the Germany entrepreneurs. And actually, if we have a lot of stagnation in the world economic development, that will be the biggest threat to the security and the safety for the whole world. So under cooperation and development, we need to have a further exploration of future cooperation rather than to give up the opening up on the pretext of security or the other issues. So I would like to ask you a follow-up question, because you have a deep diving participation in China's accession to WTO and other international treaties, which China is a signatory parties. You also mentioned a lot of threats and uncertainties that we are facing, because the borderline between the national security, safety, and also the economic development is becoming more blurry and more vague at the time being. So how can we draw a more distinct borderline between the two to address the balance between development and also the maintenance of the geopolitical security and also the national security? It requires all the WTO members and all the nations to reach a consensus based on cooperation. I think a lot of issues are highly politicized, or they are overemphasized relating to their role or impact in the national security. So this concept of pan-security is too vague and it is too aggressive. Sometimes it is a little bit groundless. That means, for my own perspective, I believe that the major nations or the major powers in the world should adhere to the WTO rules. Under the ecosystem of the WTO rules, there are a lot of explicit definition or connotation of what we should do facing the emergency, like the war or the forthcoming crisis or the military conflict, etc. Except for those kind of urgency or contingency scenario, it is not sensible to use those kind of arbitration or to have the trade war or to launch the trade war, etc. So if trade wars can be launched in a very random, or it can be acted on impulse, that means the whole world will be in a world of jungles. That means those who can have a higher number of muscles will be more aggressive.
Please begin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak at today's forum on geopolitical developments and their impact on trade, supply chain, and industrial policy, an important set of issues for all American companies. So this year, the U.S.-China Business Council celebrates our 50th anniversary in pursuit of our mission, growing the bilateral commercial relationship by advocating for U.S. companies doing business in China. We have promoted ongoing reform and opening process in China. We're delighted at China's expansion and industrial progress, becoming the largest trading country in the world, becoming the largest manufacturing country in the world. And we recognize that American companies, farmers, workers, and ranchers have also benefited from that. And we believe firmly that continued economic reform is important for continued economic expansion in China. Of course, over the last few years, the world has grown more complicated, and discussions about supply chains have moved from the far-flung corners of companies' logistics departments to corporate strategy teams and boardrooms. And at the same time, governments around the world are focused on supply chain resiliency amid heightened economic and national security concerns. The shift became particularly evident with the COVID-19 epidemic, which made even normal household consumers aware that supply chains are important. And we learned an important fact, that one never wants to be reliant on a single point of failure within your supply chain. Geopolitical issues threaten the long-term ability for international firms to rely on China. Our recent member survey shows that 1/3 of our companies reported the impact of U.S.-China tensions resulted in delayed or canceled investments in China, with 34% of our members changing their own suppliers to mitigate uncertainty around continued supply. Nevertheless, trade continues to grow rapidly, reaching a record $758 billion between the United States and China last year. And this two-way trade and investments have contributed to the prosperity of both of our peoples, but there's plenty of room to do a much better job on both sides. We implore both governments in China and the US to consult with industry and take steps to lower trade and investment barriers and create a more predictable policy regulatory environment. In 2022, COVID-19 was a challenge. Today, in both countries, we are facing a possible overemphasis on national security, which could unnecessarily darken the business landscape for both Chinese and foreign companies. For effective commerce, both governments should fine-tune their risk assessments and better define what constitutes national security-related industry. This clarity will aid businesses in adhering to regulations and avoiding a conflict of law. And this will provide the certainty that is necessary for companies to continue to invest. While China's post-COVID economic recovery is commendable, there is an awful lot of work to do. The IMF recently released Article 4 consultation report on China, which recommended that China pivot towards stimulating household spending to achieve more sustainable economic growth. Tax relief and stimulus programs can support expanded household demand and foster quality economic growth. And in addition, the IMF recommends that state-owned enterprises be reformed. All written and unwritten preferential treatment given to SOEs should be eliminated to ensure competitive neutrality and a level playing field for all firms in China. This will lead to a more productive allocation of capital assets and allow the market to play a decisive role. The economic distortions in the Chinese domestic economy are very large. China has about 18% of the global population and about 17% of global GDP, but China has only 12% of global consumption, and in contrast, has approximately 30% of global investment. These distorted numbers suggest that it is urgent that there be an increase in household consumption and that investment be reduced as a percentage of total GDP. Correcting the domestic imbalances within the Chinese economy would do much to stabilize the global economy and would also help global geopolitical stability. Among the current geopolitical challenges, and given the importance of maintaining economic stability, it's essential that China continue to prioritize further reform and opening. And that is why USCBC continues to encourage the US and Chinese governments to work together on a bilateral agenda that prioritizes commercial issues and preserves the benefits of our economic relationship. The IMF recommends that China move further away from local protectionism and amplify reliance on the economy and the market forces, and we couldn't agree more. Further opening the market would allow international business, the international business community, to maximize its stabilizing role and to serve as a foundation to build the trust necessary to tackle the even more difficult problems within the relationship. A new phase of economic reform and opening would help us to address global challenges such as climate change and global food security, which no one country can tackle alone. And without these reforms, trade diversion and regionalizing deglobalized supply chains may move from a near-term trend to long-term permanence. We share the concerns of the IMF that a bifurcation of the global economy will lead to reduced global economic growth, and thus that would be a concern for global peace and security. Therefore, I'm encouraged by the restart of high-level visits from the U.S. officials to China this year, and we hope to see more engagements by the two governments. The U.S. and China have benefited considerably through economic integration that has developed since reform and opening. At the U.S.-China Business Council, we remain committed to expanding the U.S.-China commercial relationship by advocating for American companies doing business in China, and we look forward to continuing to support that growth for the next 50 years. The American businesses remain hopeful about the size and the dynamism of the Chinese market. And in an evolving world, we need to work together to safeguard strong, stable, and resilient global industrial supply chains for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Allen, for your insights on how to further improve the economic relations between the world's two largest economies. And previously, because Mr. Yi mentioned this zero-sum mindset, that we're seeing some positive developments. We have the California governor in China this week talking about the more successful China is, the more successful we all will be. From your perspective, how widely shared is this cooperative perspective within the United States? Thank you.
Well, I'd like to echo Prime Minister Shipley's comments about APEC. That is a forum in which ideas can be tested and where top leaders can sit face to face to resolve problems. I agree that the threat of a bifurcation of large-scale decoupling is very real, and that should give us all pause. So it is APEC offers the leadership a chance to sit down to discuss political issues and geopolitical threats and come to a common understanding. And it is only with that understanding that the economics will be allowed to fully flower. Politics and economics must grow together. Outside of a political framework, the economics economics are constrained by the political framework. And I'm hopeful that we will see breakthroughs in both the economics and the political framework as our leadership meets in San Francisco on November 14, just a few weeks from now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're encouraged by what you said, that U.S. companies is committed to further invest in China, and we hope we can prosper together. And next, I'd like to invite Professor Zhao Zhongxiu. Professor Zhao, please share with us your perspectives on the geopolitical developments and its impacts on globalization, supply chains, trade, and many other issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for inviting me to this forum and give me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the broad topics of industrial policy and global supply chain restructuring. In 2023 of this year, the global economy has clearly reached a new critical juncture where techno-nationalist industrial policies are regaining popularity, while de-risking and the fragmentation of global value chains seems to be the unfolding reality. At this point, we need to revisit seriously the economic rationale for industrial policy from the triple perspective of theory, history, and policy. The developed world, and particularly the United States, used to favor laissez-faire over government intervention. and aggressively promoted the free market doctrine. It came from Adam Smith from University of Glasgow, commonly known as the Washington Consensus. To the developing countries, free market advocates often dismiss the necessity for industrial policy, citing information barriers and potential rent sinking as powerful arguments against it. In the face of intensifying competition for technological supremacy and increasingly geopolitical complexity, however, here seems to be a resurgence of industrial policy in the developed world in recent years, most notably towards the semiconductor industry, through techno-nationalist industrial policies, primarily in the form of direct subsidies and tax credits. All major developed economies in the world have been pushing for the reshoring of advanced chip manufacturing capacity, as well as the localization or friend-shoring of their respective semiconductor supply chains. While this process is still unfolding, the following phenomena is already emerging. The global race to have its own fabs has led to the fragmentation of the global semiconductor value chain and the market, which in return, this is likely to result in the halting of innovation, overcapacity, underutilization, and the global technological bifurcations, or even jeopardize the highly efficient business and innovation model of the semiconductor industry that been operating on the basis of dedicated specialization among the semiconductor GVC. As economists, we need to explore and establish from both theoretical and historical perspective of the conditions necessary and sufficient under which the industrial policy can achieve the goals of the government, as well as the conditions under which the policy is efficiency, welfare enhancing, and capable of achieving Pareto improvement. It is clear that poor industrial policy can stifle innovation, create sustainable inefficiency, intensify market concentration, and waste valuable taxpayers' funds. Various financial incentives, especially industrial subsidies, have been the tools for implementing industrial policy implementation. However, the history, in particular, that prior to the conclusion of Tokyo Round Subsidiary Code in 1979, has taught us that competitive subsidization will lead to a mutually wasteful expenditure and a lose-lose situation, thereby reducing the overall welfare for the world. Based on the historical experience, it is imperative for us as policy advisors to revisit the ground of and the extent to which industrial subsidies are justifiable. At the same time, it is high time for the major economies to sit down and to develop some consensus on the rules governing industrial subsidies within a multilateral framework, presumably the WTO, so as to prevent efficiency destroying competitive subsidization. In short, in the face of rising industrial policies across the globe, the WTO needs an updated toolbox. Thank you.
Professor Zhao, thank you so much. I'd like your response quickly to this. Do you think is it possible to discuss how industrial policies are not distorting market and how to make sure it is fair, especially among a lot of companies?
实施这个产业政策现在是一个
In terms of the industrial policies, indeed, it is a heated topic. In the past, the global economic situation has been pushing towards the globalization and free market. And for the industrial policies, facing a lot of limitations in that backdrop. However, now that reality has disrupted our understanding, the textbook understanding of the industrial policies, especially in the past, the Washington Consensus had a limitation to the industrial policies, but now the industrial policies became widely popular. The problem is there isn't a global international regulations to regulate the practice in various countries. It has been used as an instrument. Although it is widely used, but the target was not for the best in economic interest, but a political tool and to pursue the national security aims, or sometimes it's a value-based division. So I believe that it can be said as it was being abused. So now the world is kind of in a chaos. So it required us to have international rules to be reformed, and the old established rules need to be reformed and at least developed or upgraded. So the multilateralism is important. WTO has an excellent foundation. We should enhance it, push it forward instead of weakening it. So the WTO, as well as other multilateral organizations, of course, it is facing a lot of challenges, but maybe it can be reborn as a phoenix. So we need to push forward the multilateral mechanism. Indeed, industrial policy is an important topic worth much research. I believe that Professor Masakali and Mr. Yi might have a comment on their insights of the European.
Well, Chair, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this important issue, and thank you to the IFF for bringing us together. I think there's no doubt that the world economy faces some really serious potential headwinds because of what's happening around geopolitics and trade. We're now seeing a world after many, many decades in which since 1945 we've seen a reduction in trade barriers. We're now seeing a sudden change of direction. And there's this very ugly expression called geo-economic fragmentation, which has made its way into the economics literature, which was coined by colleagues recently at the International Monetary Fund. I think at the outset, it really is important to understand how much globalization has helped many people, many millions of people around the world economy. Despite some localized negative effects from greater trade integration, such as economic restructuring in some of the advanced economies, over the world, it's essentially lifted many people out of poverty. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And in fact, I thank Professor Zhao for mentioning Adam Smith, because he is from my institution, the University of Glasgow. It's his 300th anniversary of his birth this year, and it's about nearly 250 years since he published that Wealth of Nations, in which he explained very clearly what the losses were from protectionism and what the gains from trade were. I want to just mention three things in my remarks, and I think it's just to understand, first of all, that we're not at the precipice yet in terms of geo-economic fragmentation. It's already been pointed out that actually trade as a proportion of world GDP is still at very high levels. It's roughly double where it was in 1970. However, it's come off the peak, and some of this is due to the increasing trade barriers which are certainly hitting us. This is a chart which comes from the IMF. It comes from a study by Shekhar Iyer and other colleagues in the IMF. And it shows you just how serious the problem is getting. This is using the Global Trade Alerts database to show you just how many protectionist measures are being taken. And all of a sudden, until 2017, 18, the numbers weren't great. And then 2018-20 sees the initial trade war, if you like, between the US and China, with tariffs increasing in the US and China responding. And then since then, we've seen many other measures. I wanted just to emphasize just how much this could hurt the global economy. And actually, there are perhaps two boundary scenarios I wanted to mention. One is what we might call strategic decoupling, because as other colleagues have said, some of this has been cast around the issue of security, and particularly in high-tech industries. But actually, the reality is that if it was just limited to that, it wouldn't have as big an impact on the world economy. The real problem comes when it expands beyond simply high-tech. And I think this chart gives you a pretty good idea of that. This comes from, again, from the IMF, from colleagues, Marijn Bolhuis and other colleagues of the IMF, and they'd look at two scenarios. One of them, which is shown by the blue chart, which shows you the GDP losses. If it was just a fragmentation where trade ceases between China, Russia, and their economic areas, and the US, EU, then actually, in reality, all this does is divert trade. It becomes less efficient, but actually the losses in terms of GDP is not that great. The problem really comes when that becomes geo-economic fragmentation. If the world really were to separate out into two blocks, depending on which countries, which block they trade with most, assigning countries to each block, then that would have an absolutely huge impact. It would show that it would be, Bolhuis and colleagues of the IMF estimate this at 2.3% of global GDP, a permanent shock, equivalent to the size of the French economy. And actually, for some countries, for some blocks, it would be even greater. You can see that for low-income countries, this would be absolutely disastrous, as for emerging markets. So these are serious shocks. And in fact, it may be worse than that. The WTO has recently done a similar study and has shown that the effect could actually be as high as 6.4% of GDP for the advanced economies, or 10.2% for emerging markets, 11.3% for low-income countries. Just unimaginable numbers in terms of the losses. Now, within that, of course, there may be arguments for some degree of nearshoring. Mr. Allen has already pointed out, COVID has made many companies think about their supply chains. And that is important, and to some extent, diversifying and reducing risks is important. But this is, and I wouldn't say any more because I think he outlined very clearly what the issues are. But let me just add one point to what he said, which is that uncertainty is really serious here, because there are sunk costs in creating new supply chains. So if there were to be a greater uncertainty as to what would happen around trade barriers, actually that is likely to lead to more fragmentation. So this is one area why the multilateral system really needs to try to address this issue of greater uncertainty, because otherwise the danger is, even without additional trade barriers going up, simply de-risking will actually lead to greater fragmentation. So I think that's a really important point. You then mentioned the issue of industrial policies. And of course, I don't need to go into the details of the US Inflation Reduction Act, because it sets out many domestic sourcing and final assembly requirements, which will impact seriously on international trade rules. And of course, the EU has countered that with its own Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Net Zero Industry Act, the legislation designed to realize the plan, which are very similar in scope to the US IRA. And although these things are, of course, designed to address climate change, there's no doubt that there are protectionist elements in them, and they will actually seriously impact on trade. And the difficulty with all this is, of course, it's very tempting for other governments to follow suit and with subsidies or trade barriers to counteract the impact of US and EU industrial policy. So what could governments do? And I think this is the question. Can we do something in this context? Now, the IMF, again, has made some suggestions, and this is around this notion of pragmatic multilateralism. And is this a way forward? And this is roughly the idea that there are three sort of basic routes through here. And this chart, again, comes from the IMF. What does this mean? What does this chart mean? Basically, what the IMF is saying is it's trying to encourage a multilateral effort in areas of clear common interests. For instance, climate change mitigation, in that area, or in food security, or in pandemic preparedness, or in debt issues. And as was mentioned earlier in the opening, in the opening ceremony at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO in July last year, agreements covered fisheries subsidies, for instance. And this was the first multilateral agreement conducted by the WTO since 2013. So it shows that it can be done where there are real interests, for instance, around COVID vaccines, around food programs. I think in some of these areas, we should be able to do something. Then in the yellow band, if you like, when it's not possible to have multilateral agreements, but some WTO members want to do more, they should be able to agree open and non-discriminatory plurilateral initiatives. And this would be on the basis that agreements are open. They're open to anybody else who wants to join. WTO members don't discriminate, shouldn't discriminate between different foreign producers. And if you like, deep regional trade agreements could be part of this, as long as they're not discriminatory. An element of this could also be around areas around climate clubs. And again, if they're done in a non-discriminatory way, I know there's been some discussions at G7 to do this, but you could think about whether at G20 level, climate clubs could be a way for some of these subsidies that are being designed to come together. And then finally, when it comes to difficult issues, when countries are determined to put in subsidies, for instance, which could be protectionist, or indeed other measures around local content requirements or competition laws. These are distortive measures which are happening often well behind the border, in a sense. They're not part of the trade agreements. Then I think there need to be some sort of guardrails around this at WTO level, attempts to basically have at least consultations on these issues. And this is what the IMF recommends, which I think is sensible, looking at ways of having consultative frameworks around when a country wants to introduce subsidies, wants to introduce content measures or competition laws, which are not to do with trade agreements. Ultimately, of course, we would like to redesign the WTO. It's been mentioned a few times already in this panel. I can't see this happening immediately. It requires a lot of patience, and colleagues have already mentioned, ultimately it requires the biggest players, the US, China, to be part of that. But ultimately, even if we can't achieve that, if we could find ways of structuring some of these discussions around this more pragmatic multilateralism, that might be the best way of achieving this, even although the best scenario may not be available to us. And I look forward to discussing some of these issues. Thank you.
I completely agree with you about the risk of geo-economic fragmentation. And I'd like to ask one thing about, you must be aware of the EU inquiry into China's electric vehicles. And the EU said it won't be political driven, but will be handled within the WTO framework. Could you help us understand how will the WTO handle these kind of issues related to these green subsidies? Actually, some experts said we need a subsidy war to galvanize global effort to speed up the transition. How to balance the need to fight climate change and trade fairness? Thank you.
Thank you. And then these are key areas, of course. Electric vehicles are a key area where, of course, there is an attempt to use subsidies partly to gain an advantage where there are scale economies clearly in that kind of sector. Look, at the end of the day, as I said, the only way forward there is, and it's what colleagues have said, we need open discussions around some of these subsidies. There are no easy solutions. Ultimately, I think most of the advanced economies that are likely to have an interest in the area of electric vehicles should be able to get around the table and have a discussion. There is enough scale there to be able to reach a deal around some of these things. But it's as sensitive as some of the issues around climate clubs for carbon intensive products like steel and concrete. I think similarly in this area there needs to be a genuine discussion, and we probably need guardrails around this in terms of how the WTO handles this. So hopefully the only way forward, I think, is through consultation. There are no easy answers there around EVs, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Alessandro Teixeira, IFF board member and visiting professor of School of Management and Economics at Chinese University of Hong Kong, joining us online. Professor Teixeira, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guan. I would like to greet my colleagues at the panel, also congratulate IFF for the 20th birthday. there is an advantage and a disadvantage to be the last one on the panel. The disadvantage is many things they want to talk about it is already expressed, so I don't want to go there. But I want to start by talking just by reassuring what we heard here, that the world is living what we call polycrisis. And some people, they think that this is just a momental crisis. But we live and we need to deal with a structural crisis from the point of view of political crisis, from the point of view of economic structural crisis. And I don't want to talk, I think President Shipley already mentioned the political part, and I would say the trade-off sometimes with national politics against international politics, and how hard is for a leader to deal with that. But I want to focus in my domain, that is economics. Okay? And one of the elements that I want to talk about, that we have a different world that we have 10, 20 years ago. And why? Is because developing countries, and that's my perspective, now they represent more than 50% of the GDP, and they represent more than 50% of the global trade share. And that's an important element. Why? Because this structural crisis that we live in terms of economic is not only regarding developing countries, but is a global structural crisis. So when you're talking about climate change, when you're talking about poverty reduction, when you're talking about unemployment, when we are talking about decrease of productivity, when you are talking about crime and security, those elements are not anymore only developing country issues, are developed country issues. Crime has been, and insecurity has been on the rise of developed countries, not only developing issues. And it seems that when we go to answers, we are trying to look only for our answers, and those are global issues. And I can give you an example on that, on health and education, or we can go to international migration. Okay, we can talk about housing, we can talk about sanitation. And you're going to say, but Professor, why you are talking about this if this is a geopolitical development? Because we cannot talk about trade, we cannot talk about supply chain, and certainly we cannot understand industrial policy if we don't understand those challenges. And why? It's not a criticism, but I hear a lot for the last 20 years about industrial policy rebirth. And I would like to state for you, gentlemen, that industrial policy never died. Never died. Maybe we didn't disclosure that United States has a very strong industrial policy. European Union had a very strong industrial policy, maybe not with the name of industrial policy, because they, for a long time, they understood that science, technology, that trade are central pillars of industrial policy. The name is not manufacturing policies, are industrial policy for a long, long, long time. So nobody in the world stopped to do industrial policies. Ladies and gentlemen, they are there, they are active. And when you're talking about, WTO and tariffs, we've been reducing tariffs. That's true. But let's talk about, as Ms. Anton just mentioned, let's talk about no tariff barriers. This has been growing for a long, long time. Technical barriers. Let's talk about, we don't have dumping. We do have a lot of dumping that is not about only commercial dumping, but it's financial dumping. So my point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to face the challenges in front of us. And of course, we have been going through fragmentation in the political level and in economic level for a long time. It's not just after COVID. Decoupling process or trying one country to solve the problems by itself, it's a long time. We can pay attention what Secretary Gutierrez has been talking in the last 5 years, that out of the SDGs, the 17, we are far away to achieving a single one. So all the commitments that we had in Paris Agreement are not being achieved. All the commitments that we had in Kyoto Agreement is not being achieved. Poverty is not reducing, is increasing. Hunger has not been reduced, is increasing. So my point, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need multilateralism. It's the only way forward. We need to face challenges at the global level with multilateralism. That's why we need to talk about it. How can we reform, fix the World Trade Organizations, the governance of the world? Because what we have been seeing lately is that the world is changing, but our governance system is not changing. It's still the same. And I'm sorry, I don't want to blame one country to another, but it's impossible you have in WTO, and that's not, again, I don't want to attack United States, but it's impossible for one country in the world to block negotiations that's supposed to be multilateral. You know, we cannot face this. We cannot talking about those elements. And just as my final words is that it's very important for developing countries that we have this candid conversation, because it's their right in terms of develop to reindustrialize itself, or in some cases to industrialize itself. And I want to bring back the African continent that is suffering a lot with mitigation of climate change, with adaptation of climate change, with the necessity to industrialize itself, not to be only a supplier from raw commodities and don't have a perspective for their future. And I hear for a long time IMF and World Bank talking about building capabilities or institutional capabilities, or pointing out that one of the elements that those countries, they don't achieve development is because they are not ready, is because they have too much corruption, is because, no, we need to stop it's because. And we need to work together to find global solutions, because it's the way forward. We cannot. And if the people, they don't believe that climate change is impacting the world, look what's going on. Do you know? And just to finalize that, look what Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asian have been suffering with slides, with flooding, with earthquakes. I think those elements needs to be done at the global level. And I think IFF is very happy to push this discussion. And it's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you very, very much. I'm looking for the discussion. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Professor Teixeira. And those are very thought-provoking comments. And I have a lot of questions, but I'd like to open the floor to questions to see if someone here with us today can grab this precious opportunity to ask our panelists a question.
现场的观众有人想抓住这个机会来问一两个问题吗？如果有的话，请举手。好，那位先生。有麦克风吗？
我有个问题想问一下那个。
I have a question to President Yi Xiaojun. Currently, with such a shocking changes 3 years ago, we've already seen a lot of global problems. 2 years ago, the IA laws has a great impact to the new energy companies in China, and the law had a lot of limitations to China's PV companies that has been just shipping from Vietnam and other Southeast Asia countries, which means that till June, the PV that's been shipped from China to Southeast Asia to US is going to suffer a lot. And for EU, UE, including the anti-subsidies of the new energy vehicles as well as the carbon tax issue, actually the carbon price vary greatly between Euro and China. And in China, it's only 30 to 40. Euro is 800 to 900. So all the MEVs being shipped to EU are going to have their profits squeezed. And the carbon tracking is the full life cycle, so posting even greater pressure. So now the China's MEV industry is very big. And now in Europe, EU markets and in US market, we're going to see a lot of changes because of the new laws being introduced. So how can we solve this problem? Because now between China and US, we of course need to work more together to tackle the climate change, but they're competing with one another in industries like new energy vehicles. So how do you look at the Chinese energy upgrading as well as its exporting overseas? How could we achieve a more balanced development? Thank you. Thank you for your question. It is rather complicated, but a simple response is we are facing a lot of new issues, and we need to require all the major parties, especially the major economies, to abide by the WTO's multilateral rules. You talk a lot about a lot of industrial policies, including the US policies as well as the EU policies. They need to strictly abide by the multilateral trade agreements. There are already very clear cut rules, including industrial policies. If you look at it, there are several things. To buy domestic, second, local content requirement. That is when investing, a certain percentage need to go to your own country, and then subsidies, high tariff, trade limitations. If all of those were abiding by WTO rules, I think that the industrial policies would not attract as much concerns. Then now the major problem is the current subsidies, how to deal with it. I believe that China had a clear-cut stance, that is, for subsidy, had requirements in WTO. We're going to abide by these requirements. If the governments want to revise these rules, we need to sit together. EU, US, other members need to sit together to discuss and reach a consensus. If anything need to be updated. So that's the first thing I want to put on the table. Second thing is when you are facing so many uncertainties, China, US, EU, these big economies, entities need to sit together, negotiate, discuss to find solutions. Because in the multilateral sector arenas, actually it is possible to work multilaterally because during COVID, China, US, Europe, we had reached agreements on the waiving of the TRIPS waiver, the IP rights. And China had also actually issued a claim about treating the plastic pollution. US recently participated, and the fishing subsidy, and as the principal talked about, WTO recently reached a very important multilateral agreement. So actually, for these three big entities, there are some aspects that they could cooperate and could reach agreements. So I'm really hoping that they can do so. Thank you.
Thank you all the panelists for your very inspiring, thought-provoking sharings. I want to address a question to maybe all of the panelists today regarding global investment, because we will never overlook the role that investment or ODI, FDI play in the global economic landscape. And it seems that I have noticed a phenomenon that in the global landscape, there is a missing or a vacuum about global investment governance. Which means that whether it's under WTO discussion in OECD, in G20, we seem to lack a global consensus or global regulations about investment. China recently just successfully led the the discussion about investment facilitation, which seems to be very successful, but still in the future we have a long way to go. So I want to address this question probably to Chairwoman Jenny Shipley or other WTO expert, how we can expect the outcome of the future of global investment coordination, and how can we promote and facilitate a synergy among different multilateral platforms so that we can have a better coordinated investment principle, investment policy, not only in the national level, but particularly in a multilateral level. Thank you.
Ms. Shibley?
No,
He's directing this to you specifically.
No, I would only give you a political answer. I think this is a technical question. And there are people at this table who probably are aware of some of the progress being made already, where the international financial architecture and the rules around it are constantly being discussed. I mean, I agree with the fact that there's a huge amount still to be done, but I don't have anything specific to add to this answer to the question of who is doing it and what progress is being made.
Hello. Yes. So that's it's a big question on this. I had the opportunity to be the president of the World Investment Association, WIPA, for 7 years, and as the gentleman pointed, it's a hole on the international governance system. Why? Because UNCTAD, everybody thinks that UNCTAD is only trade, but try to use the mandate to talk about investment. WTO the same, MIGA from the World Bank the same. So we had not a fight, but a discussion who would be pushing to advocate the increase of FDI around the world. And that's a key element, because many of the policies related in terms of industrial policy with subsidies has to do to attract investment to the country. Lately, we have been talking, and even OECD have been proposing a minimum tax around the globe, especially, and these impact quite a lot the capacity of the country to promote investment attraction. So what we call OFDI. So the point here is that this is one of the, I would say, fissures in the international governance system. Who deals with investment promotion? Who deals with agreement in terms of international investment facilitation? Because this is normally is done bilateral, a country to a country agreement, but we need to address that from the technical point of which institution will be responsible to help the countries to design an investment promotion strategy or investment attraction strategy.
Thank you. I think Mr. Allen may have something to say about this. What do you hope to see in terms of progress to further attract foreign investment, and what do you perceive the risks, for example, related to the bifurcation of technology ecosystems, which is posing challenge for multinational companies?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the issue of industrial policies. As I noted, China's economy is very distorted. Consumption is about 12% of world GDP, investment at 30% of world GDP. And that distortion is driving a lot of the tensions within the global economy. And so this fundamental issue has to be addressed. How do we increase consumption in China? How do Chinese households have the confidence to purchase more? And we're talking about many percentage points of GDP. And so according to Scott Kennedy of the CSIS, China has approximately four times the amount of industrial subsidies available than the next closest country, which would be Korea. According to Barry Naughton of the University of San Diego, China has reserved approximately 11% of GDP for industrial subsidies. And so it is true that this degree of subsidization and this degree of overinvestment is causing enormous amounts of global overcapacity. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, wind. We could go on and on about the negative effects of overcapacity due to these distortions inherent in China's domestic economy, and those distortions must be addressed. So China has received a lot of foreign direct investment, some of it attracted by these investment subsidies. But I would argue that for the fundamental long-term sustainable health of the Chinese economy, the critical issue is really increasing consumption. And that is one that we have not really addressed here adequately. And indeed, increasing imports as a percentage of total consumption would be very, very much benefit the Chinese people, Chinese consumers, and Chinese households. And I hope that we are able to see that type of policy mix in the years ahead. Because if we cannot address these fundamental distortions, then I think that the WTO is going to have more and more problems, and we're not going to be able to get to that place where we would like to go. Thank you.
I'd like to discuss this with Mr. Yi and Professor Zhao. How can we increase the transparency, maybe from the multilateral level, about industrial subsidies and prevent distortionary trade practice? And on consumption, I think China's contribution of consumption is rising gradually over the years. What more can be done? Thank you.
关于透明度，其实 WTO 始终有一套规则。
has set a lot of rules relating to transparency, including the subsidy regulation and also different kinds of the rule of thumb for subsidy. But for some of the WTO members, they believe that there should be new round of consultation relating to the subsidization and also the subsidy granting to the industries in their respective countries. As it was mentioned by Greg Allen, I applaud his views. That is to say, between China and US, we need to have further discussion. How can we better incentivize the consumption in China, and how to better increase those kind of domestic investments in US? As it was mentioned, and actually for Kennedy, I'm a good friend of him, and I share some of the different views in a humble manner, but due to the interest of the time, I cannot address every detail. As it was asked by the gentleman, he asked about the global investment mechanism. I think it is a very important class, or it is a kind of vacancy or loophole for the existing mechanism. After globalization, trade and investment are closely related to each other. In the global value chain, trade has been highly correlated with investment, and also vice versa. In WTO, 2/3 of the investment are for the services industry or the services sector. So I believe that if we set up one mechanism in WTO to better guide the investment, will be very necessary. That is why in WTO discussion, China has launched some of the initiatives to have a better facilitation in the investment. Now, 110 members have already joined this mechanism for this kind of facilitation. We believe that in the future, in investment, there will be a kind of ecosystem or mechanism for investment that will be accepted by all. So, Mr. Zhao, Professor Zhao, regarding for the subsidy or transparency, here are some of my views. For different nations, they are having respective subsidy granting policy proceeding from their own demand and also their different developments of economic prosperity, etc. Subsidies are very important to them. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and there is no universal practice in terms of the subsidy granting. Between China and US or between China and EU, there are a lot of differences or nuances in those kind of subsidy granting. In those kind of differences, when China has become a member of WTO, we believe that with the further opening of the Chinese market and with the further accommodation of China's policies, there will be a high quality reform and opening of China. And also there will be greater participation and integration of China in the international conflict or arbitration mechanism. 2 weeks ago, in Belt and Road International Forum in Beijing, according to President Xi Jinping of China, he announced that there are 8 action plans that will further facilitate the integration among Belt and Road nations. So in those kind of major actions, a lot of roadblock or impediments are removed or will be removed in the foreseeable future. And there will be a gradual and phase-in opening and reform for China with a higher efficiency and greater transparency. So I believe that for Chinese policy, the playground is already leveled, and the investors or different kinds of foreign institutions or the MNC can enjoy greater facilitation on transparency in China. But whether this kind of domestic environment can accommodate their needs and whether they are adaptable enough to better address the concern or demand from the Chinese consumers, it will depend on their own development strategies in Chinese market, and that will also be a gradual process. We also witnessed that from manufacturing sector to the service sector in China, and there is a high number of vivid examples. For example, the express delivery or the courier business in China. For this kind of express delivery business in China, its development is already highly localized. And also its development in the past several years are witnessed by all the people. Some of the top-notch companies are not necessarily catering the need of the local people. So on the contrary, we can say that in China, it is participating in a lot of cross-border e-commerce, the last mile delivery, and also the e-commerce integration with the nations in the Southeast Asian nations. And also that is a practice that is highly localized, very different from DHL, from FedEx practice in US, etc. That means even China is opening its market for the express delivery. It does not mean that the foreign players like FedEx or DHL can accommodate the local customers' needs most. So a lot of localized players have already having a lot of existing market share. So that means there are different kinds of the sectors or the sub-segments that may be different in terms of the appealingness to the foreign companies. In the past decades, China has learned a lot, and also not all the prior experiences are beneficial. We need to have the global vision, global wisdoms, and we need to be blessed with the local characteristic and also the local demand, and also how to customize the local need. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Mr. Blake, I'd like to have your take on this. Because Gerard said about the need of change of global governance to reflect the voice of developing countries. What is your take on this?
The Bretton Woods framework, which we've really used for the last, 60, 70 years now, can be argued that it's served us very well, and the but is that the reason it was established in the first place was to deal with a relatively narrow set of consequences post war. And now we're confronted with a massively different global population, 2.5 billion in, I think, the Bretton Woods era, if I can recall correctly, and what are we knocking 9 billion. So there are far more human beings who have an interest in prosperity, global security, their well-being than was the case at the time. And I think we've already traversed the fact that the institutions that were designed don't have enough of the diverse voices at the table. They're not necessarily flexible enough, and there does have to be reform. But again, there's another but, and I want to come to the industrial policy issue here, because I think it's been an interesting discussion over the whole day, hearing what we use the word subsidy still. But in my observation, we will have to become more sophisticated in our thinking if we're committed to climate change and using green finance. Green finance is effectively a mechanism of investment that is trying to reward good behavior and facilitate transition and transformation. Now, in the old days, we would probably say, oh, well, we're going to subsidize these industries because they're good industries, or we may have just said we're going to subsidize these industries in order to get significant development. But I think I listened to the EV conversation, and as one who comes from a country where I think I can still claim that we've got some of the least subsidy structures across the whole economy. We only deal in global flow, and our individual consumers at home pay the global price, and it is what it is. But we're increasingly discussing, if we want to change behavior, is there a difference when you say, well, I'm going to pay you a certain portion of the cost of your EV if you'll transition from a gas guzzling large vehicle, because New Zealanders love big cars and trucks and things, to something that's more efficient. And so coming back to my colleague's comments about the WTO is capable, in my opinion, in grappling with some of these complex issues. And maybe we need to again move past the language, because a lot of the developing world doesn't have to repeat our mistakes. As they develop, we also want them to be able to be adopting some of the lead technology rather than going through the old revolution, reform and industrialization track. If they can leap across that, are we going to call it subsidization, or are we going to call it strategic investment? My last comment is about the question of investment. Look, be careful not to over-regulate. I mean, there are elements of discussion that we have to have, but there are some things that if you try and create rules, you create stagnation. And you also create an incentive for people to defy the rules, or find their way around the rules, in my experience. The best regulatory and legislative environments, in my experience, both globally, regionally and nationally, have grappled properly with the issues, but in a transparent but light-handed way, given people a clear steer of where they're free to invest and where they should not go. And I think that in the financial sector globally, it's so diverse now. There are multiple levels of investment track. There are private players, there are institutional players, there are different elements and products and vehicles, and we want to continue to see innovation. And my own anxiety is if we get the regulator in front of the innovator, we may miss some of the opportunity in a digital world. And so, again, I don't wish to talk down all of us who are either experienced politicians or observers or leaders or academics, but often those things that are trending and where we're talking about the need for direct foreign investment and rapid deployment, often our institutions aren't fleet-footed enough to be able to grapple with the issues to get ahead of the trend. And so I'm inclined to say, look, let the market flow with a clear set of rules, and if you need to, then regulate on the margin, because we need the innovation. The developing world, and indeed some of the developed economies, need diverse investment to do short and long-term products. So both investment and, let's be careful with our language around the old trap of subsidies and all of that sort of pre-globalization language, that we're not still using it when we're confronted with a completely different set of challenges. For me, green finance may have to mean that we are going to not so much pick winners, but you don't get transitions. And often the human being will not make a change unless they see the destination of why am I doing this? And by the way, someone's giving me a helping hand. That will get us further more quickly than if we are just agnostic. And so I do think we're facing a challenge, even for a marketeer like myself, that I'm confronted with having to think about. Should we tax bad things and support good things, whatever that means? And I do think the international architecture, it's a very good time to try and have those discussions. I could talk about consumption, but I'll resist that. I want to reserve the right as individuals to spend their money how they like. I hear the US's frustration, but I think the transition we're seeing in China is highly predictable. They're highly well organized as a producer of outstanding goods that the world needs. They're great savers, which most of the world is not, and they're cautious as they spend, and they will make their own decisions about when they expand consumption, albeit that countries like the US and New Zealand and others will benefit enormously as the Chinese consumer gains its confidence and its ability to spend.
I'd like to have Professor Mascatelli to wrap up this for us.
Well, I just actually wanted to endorse Prime Minister Shipley's comments. I think they're very wise. This is already complicated as it is. Trying to achieve coordination on a number of points, as already has been pointed out, whether it's around subsidies and some of the details, is complicated enough without actually trying to bring investment into play, which, as has been said, actually is a much more complicated picture. I would also, I mean, I think there's going to be having a genuine discussion, multilateral discussion, which explains how these subsidies are genuinely designed to back particular technologies with work for our particular geographies, is complicated enough without trying to boil the ocean here and actually trying to involve other discussions around the complications of investment. I think we need to stick to the basics, otherwise we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve, which is to reduce some of the tensions around the world trading system.
Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank the questions from the floor, and we're going to wrap up here. And many thanks to our panelists again. Indeed, a lot need to be done, but they have chartered a wise course forward, I think. Well, thank you very much. And coming up next is for more discussions on the role of APEC in fostering cooperation among its member countries. My colleague Zhen Junfeng engages in a conversation with two distinguished experts in the field. Stay tuned.